The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 48 Sacred Risk. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. This is the place where we sit with what's raw, what's hidden, and what most people avoid. In this episode, we're stepping onto the edge into the places where life feels dangerous, uncertain, and alive. Risk has always been the threshold of transformation. Ancient cultures understood this. They walked on fire, entered wilderness alone, or faced trials that stripped away comfort and forced them into presence. Today, risk looks different. It shows up in extreme sports, in leaving behind what's familiar, in speaking truths that could cost belonging. Sometimes risk is chosen, other times it finds us in illness, loss, or the unexpected rupture of ordinary life. But in every form, risk is more than chance. It's initiation. It shakes us out of sleep, dismantles illusions, and reveals what matters most. When faced with danger, we come alive, the body sharpens, the heart races, time slows. Risk can terrify, but it can also sanctify. It becomes sacred when it teaches us how to live more fully, not in spite of fear, but because of it. Across this episode, we'll explore how danger and adventure have been ritualized, how modern psychology understands the lure of risk, and how brushes with the unknown can transform both individuals and communities. We'll sit with personal encounters, from the physical to the relational, and we'll ask what it means to carry risk not as recklessness, but as a spiritual practice woven into daily life. Because to live without risk is to live half asleep, and to live with sacred risk is to walk awake, one trembling step into the unknown. Let's begin. The threshold of danger. Risk has always been the razor's edge of human experience. It's the leap from safety into uncertainty, the moment when comfort no longer shields us and the unknown opens its mouth. Some risks are thrust upon us: illness, accidents, collapse. Others we choose: climbing mountains, starting businesses, confessing love. In every case, risk is a threshold, a doorway we step through, not knowing if it will wound us, remake us, or both. Ancient cultures recognized this. They walked on fire, hunted lions, entered caves alone, not simply to prove bravery, but to touch the sacred hidden in danger. The invitation of risk. Modern society, however, is risk-averse. We sanitize, insure, regulate, avoid. Yet the soul still longs for thresholds. Risk is not just adrenaline, it is initiation. It burns away illusion, tests our truth, and reveals what safety never will. Sacred risk is the risk that matters, the kind that strips you, reshapes you, and calls you to live more deeply. Attributes of sacred risk: uncertainty. The outcome cannot be guaranteed. Exposure, stepping outside protection into vulnerability. Intensity, heightened awareness, the body fully alive. Threshold, crossing from the known into the unknown. Revelation, the discovery of something unseen before the risk was taken. Themes: risk as right. From firewalking to martial trials, cultures have long ritualized danger as a way of burning through fear and remaking the self. Risk as adventure, exploration, climbing, rafting, and modern extreme sports echo old rituals, offering not just adrenaline but transformation. Risk as spiritual practice, monks fasting, shamans ingesting sacred plants, vision quests. Each uses danger not as accident but as doorway. Risk in modern life. Today, risk shows up less as ritual and more as accident or chance. Illness, economic collapse, sudden loss. Yet these too initiate us. Personal reflection: one brush with risk that has never left me happened while driving after a snowfall. I was traveling along a familiar road when I struck black ice. The car drifted uncontrollably into the right-hand lane, straight into the path of oncoming traffic. For a few seconds, time bent. My heart pounded, the world shrank to the narrow line between collision and escape. Somehow, by instinct or luck, I managed to guide the car back into the left lane just as headlights bore down. 5 or 10 seconds earlier, and it would have been a head-on crash at 60 miles an hour. The experience left me shaken, but also strangely awake. In that moment, I felt how thin the veil is, how life balances on threads invisible until they snap. It wasn't a risk I chose, but it was a threshold all the same. It taught me that risk isn't only about adventure or courage. Sometimes it's about being thrust into a razor-thin moment where every illusion of control disappears, and you are left staring at the fragility of life. Psychological insight: risk and the human mind. Risk is not only cultural or existential, it's deeply psychological. contemporary research shows us why danger feels so charged and why it shapes us in ways comfort never can. Neuroeconomics and risk perception studies in neuroeconomics, Glimcher, Damasio, show that risk activates a tug of war between the amygdala, fear, and the prefrontal cortex, reason. When I hit black ice, my amygdala screamed danger while my prefrontal cortex scrambled for action. Risk is the brain's way of forcing us into full presence, everything sharp and survival at stake. Stress inoculation and growth psychologist Donald Meichenbaum's theory of stress inoculation suggests that manageable exposure to stress strengthens resilience. Sacred risk works the same way. Each threshold endured inoculates us against future fear. Controlled fire becomes training, an initiation into courage that can't be taught in comfort. Adventure therapy and embodied risk. Modern fields like adventure therapy use wilderness challenges, climbing, rafting, survival tasks to foster psychological healing. Research, Priest and Gass, 2017, shows that risk in these settings increases self-efficacy and emotional regulation. Sacred risk, then, isn't just about thrill-seeking, it's about transformation through embodied trial. Existential positive psychology, PP 2.0, Paul Wong and others in existential positive psychology argue that growth comes not in avoiding suffering or danger, but in finding meaning within it. Sacred risk becomes a spiritual practice. Danger strips away illusion, leaving us face to face with what truly matters. Personal thread. That black ice moment echoes these theories. My nervous system entered survival mode, but afterwards I realized it had inoculated me against complacency. The fragility of life wasn't just theory anymore, I'd felt it. Risk stripped me bare, but it also gave me clarity. Life is fragile, but within that fragility is the invitation to live more awake. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Choose one small risk you've been avoiding, a conversation, a creative leap, a physical challenge. Step into it intentionally. As you do, notice the fear rises in the body, the pull between avoidance and action. The clarity that follows once you've crossed the threshold. Risk need not be reckless. Even the smallest threshold, crossed consciously, can burn away illusions and awaken courage. Seed to plant. The next time you feel fear tightening your chest, ask, is this risk here to wound me or to wake me? Sacred risk is rarely safe, but it is often the only way to truly step into life. If risk is a threshold, then what happens when danger becomes ritual? When risk isn't accidental but sacred, carried out as initiation. Risk as right in every culture, risk has been woven into rites of passage. Ancient societies didn't just tolerate danger, they sanctified it. Young warriors sent into the wilderness, initiates asked to walk across fire, pilgrims told to travel unarmed. The trial wasn't random. Risk itself was the teacher. Risk, when ritualized, does more than test the body. It dismantles the illusion of safety, strips identity bare, and forces us to confront mortality. In doing so, it reshapes the self. These rituals taught that growth always requires hazard. Without stepping into the unknown, you remain uninitiated. When risk becomes ritual, in modern life we may lack formal rites of danger, but risk still acts as initiation. Whether it's starting a business, confessing love, emigrating, or choosing a new path, the leap into uncertainty echoes the old rituals. Risk isn't just gambling, it's the crucible where transformation takes place. Attributes of risk as right exposure. Risk strips away certainty, leaving us raw and open. Sacrifice, stepping forward means something must be lost. Comfort, safety, the known. Courage, not fearlessness, but walking forward while fear burns. Threshold, the sense of passing from one order of life into another. Rebirth, emerging marked, scarred, but also remade. Themes, traditional initiations. Indigenous societies used risky ordeals not for spectacle, but for transformation. Firewalking in Polynesia, scarification in West Africa, or solitary vigils in freezing landscapes all carried the same message. Risk strips away illusion and reveals essence. Risk in modern rituals. Even today, we ritualize danger without always naming it. Skydiving as a rite for 18th birthdays, military boot camps, or endurance challenges like Ironman competitions carry the same architecture. Confrontation with fear, endurance of hazard, emergence with new belonging. Risk as spiritual practice. Monks living in caves, mystics fasting in deserts, activists chaining themselves in protest. all frame risk not as recklessness but as devotion. Risk here sanctifies commitment, personal reflection. One of my first real encounters with risk framed as a right wasn't ceremonial at all. It came through work. I remember walking into a factory at 19, having signed up for agency shifts. I didn't know anyone. The machines were loud, the supervisor strict, and the hours brutal. On paper, it wasn't dangerous in the same sense as firewalking, but for me it was a right. Each shift was a test. Could I endure the 12-hour grind? Could I step into the unknown rhythms of strangers? Could I handle the vulnerability of being the outsider? There was fear there, fear of failure, fear of being too slow, fear of not belonging. But every night I survived, I walked out feeling marked. Not invincible, but initiated. The risk wasn't just about keeping pace on the line. It was about proving to myself that I could step into unfamiliar territory and emerge intact. Looking back, those shifts carried the same pattern: risk as exposure, endurance as transformation. Psychological insight, risk, belonging, and the group modern psychology shows that risk doesn't only shape the individual, it bonds the group. Shared danger dissolves hierarchies and creates powerful solidarity. Communitas. Victor Turner. Turner observed that in rites of passage, initiates became equals through risk. Facing fear side by side creates what he called communitas, a deep, egalitarian bond forged in vulnerability. Stress inoculation in groups. Research on military training and wilderness therapy shows that risk endured collectively builds trust and cohesion. Shared trials create unspoken understanding. We went through this together. Social neuroscience. Studies on synchrony, Zygalatas 2019, reveal that when people endure collective rituals, firewalking, chanting, endurance challenges, their heart rates often synchronize. The body literally aligns through shared risk, belonging through ordeal. Psychologists note that groups forged in hardship often feel stronger than those built in comfort. From sports teams to activist movements, risk creates belonging because everyone has walked through the same fire. I felt this in the factory. Those nights weren't just individual tests, they were communal thresholds. The long shifts, the shared exhaustion, the pizza at 3 a.m., even the silence of watching the sunrise together, they bonded us. The risk wasn't spectacular, but it was shared, and that sharing built trust. Looking back, I see how collective risk became a kind of ritual initiation, one that made belonging possible. 6. Embodiment prompt or practice. Think of a time when you willingly stepped into something risky, a leap, a move, a confession, an adventure. Write down the fear you carried. Write down what you lost in crossing that threshold. Then write down what was given back: resilience, belonging, insight. See how risk always leaves both a scar and a gift. Integration moment risk as a right reminds us that danger is never only personal. When endured together, it weaves connection. The ordeal is not just about survival, it's about solidarity. What marks you individually also binds you communally. The lesson is simple but profound. Risk strips us down, but in doing so, it stitches us to one another. Seed to plant this week. When you feel the pull of fear, ask yourself, what if this isn't recklessness but right? What if the risk is not a gamble, but an initiation into a larger, braver version of yourself, one that belongs more deeply, both to yourself and to others? But risk doesn't only belong to ancient rites. In modern life, we meet it through adventure, voluntary thresholds where danger becomes practice. Adventure as spiritual practice, adventure in its truest form, is not just thrill seeking. It is a threshold, a deliberate encounter with uncertainty, intensity, and awe. In traditional societies, sacred risk took the form of ritual ordeals. Today, it often takes the shape of adventure, scaling mountains, running ultramarathons, plunging into wilderness, diving into seas, or even stepping into psychedelic journeys. Adventure as threshold. These are not merely hobbies or escapes, they are thresholds that demand courage, focus, and surrender. Adventure exposes us to our limits, physical, psychological, spiritual, and in doing so, it burns away distraction. Standing on the edge of exhaustion or awe, we are forced into presence. Life sharpens into breath, heartbeat, step. Adventure as spiritual practice is the voluntary fire we choose to walk into, not to destroy us, but to remind us of who we are when stripped of comfort. Attributes of adventure as spiritual risk: exhilaration, the pulse of risk and vitality that pulls us beyond the ordinary. Focus, total absorption in the task, attention narrowed to what is immediate and necessary. Altered states, experiences of flow, timelessness, and transcendence that echo ritual trance. Awe, the overwhelming recognition of forces greater than the self. Humility, the acceptance of fragility, limits, and dependence on nature, body, and chance. Themes, adventure as sacred practice, flow, and presence. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described flow as the state where challenge meets skill and self-consciousness dissolves. Adventure often triggers this. In climbing, running, or navigating wilderness, the self drops away, leaving pure presence. Altered consciousness, risk and endurance push the nervous system into heightened states. Adrenaline, dopamine, and endorphins alter perception, time stretches, focus intensifies, and the chatter of the mind falls silent. Confronting limits. Adventure places us against boundaries, cliffs, storms, fatigue, fear. In meeting them, we meet ourselves. Whether we push through, break down, or surrender, the confrontation reshapes us. Spiritual Awe, All Research Keltner Haight 2003, shows how vastness humbles the ego. Many adventurers describe mountains, oceans, or forests in sacred terms, cathedral of ice, temples of silence. Adventure teaches reverence. Adventure as ritual. For many, modern adventures substitute for ancient rites of passage. The marathon, the summit, the pilgrimage. Thresholds we create for ourselves, not because society demands it, but because our soul does. Personal reflection. For me, adventure found its form in long-distance running. I wasn't always a runner at the start. I couldn't jog more than 30 meters without collapsing into exhaustion. But over time, those distances stretched, morning by morning, mile by mile, until 13 miles became routine, and cross-country hill training shaped my weeks. There was something transformative in those cold early mornings, the sting of air in my lungs, the ache of legs pushing further than they ever had before, the silence of streets before the world awoke. Running became more than exercise, it was a discipline of presence. Each session ended not just with physical exhaustion, but with a sense of achievement that reshaped how I saw myself. The training silenced critics, both external and internal, who doubted I could ever run the London Marathon. And it did more than that. It built confidence, resilience, and a deep sense of awe at what the body and mind can do when they surrender to endurance. Looking back, those runs weren't just physical practice, they were spiritual initiations. The road became my ritual ground, the miles my prayers, the exhaustion my initiation fire. Psychological insight. Adventure as a pathway to transformation. Modern psychology has begun to recognize adventure not as mere recreation, but as a crucible of growth. Flow states. Csikszentmihalyi's research 1990 shows how flow transforms consciousness, producing joy, creativity, and resilience. Runners often describe it as the zone, where pain dissolves into rhythm and the body moves almost without thought. Peak experiences. Abraham Maslow, 1964, identified peak experiences, moments of transcendence and unity, as central to human flourishing. Adventure reliably triggers these through awe, exertion, and risk and spirituality. Breimer and Schweitzer, 2013, found that extreme athletes often describe their pursuits in explicitly spiritual language, as encounters with connection, transcendence, and meaning far beyond the physical act. Awe and humility. Contemporary studies reveal awe increases prosocial behavior, reduces stress, and enlarges perspective. Adventure creates awe not only in landscapes, but in the discovery of one's own endurance. Resilience research. Psychologists studying endurance sports highlight how voluntary risk strengthens resilience. By facing chosen hardship, individuals build the psychological muscles to face unchosen hardships with more grace. My long-distance training echoed this research. The flow of rhythm, the peak moments of breakthrough, the awe of mornings alive with silence, all became teachers. Running didn't just condition my body, it conditioned my psyche. It taught me how risk, exhaustion, and awe weave into resilience. Embodiment prompt or practice. Choose one form of micro-adventure this week. It could be an early morning run, a cold water swim, a long walk into unfamiliar ground. Do it with intention, not as exercise, not as escape, but as initiation. Afterwards, write down what risks, physical or emotional, did you notice? What exhilaration or awe arose? What did the experience teach you about your limits and about your potential? Integration adventure as spiritual practice reminds us that risk is not just external. It is a choice to step into the unknown with openness, humility, and courage. The cold air, the racing heart, the vast horizon, they are not distractions. They are mirrors of who we are when stripped of comfort. Seed to plant. This week, take one step into adventure, not for the medal, not for the thrill, but for the practice of presence. Risk is not only survived, it is sanctified when we let it teach us. But beneath every adventure is the shadow of mortality. Risk is always in some way a dance with death. Risk, mortality, and meaning every risk we take is at its root a brush with mortality. We may not always name it, but it lingers just beneath the surface, the possibility of falling, failing, or not returning. Extreme athletes, soldiers, adventurers, and even ordinary people stepping into danger all describe the same paradox. The closer they come to death, the more alive they feel. This is the dance with death, a flirtation with fragility that heightens presence. It is not a morbid fascination, but a recognition that mortality sharpens meaning. Standing on a cliff, plunging into unknown waters, or navigating danger, we are stripped of distraction. The trivial fades, only life itself remains vivid. Far from nihilism, this dance often leads to reverence. Death is no longer an abstract idea, but an intimate companion, one that teaches us how to live. Attributes of the dance with death mortality, the ever present awareness that life is finite. Courage, the willingness to face fear rather than flee. Surrender, the letting go of control in the face of uncertainty. Ecstasy, the paradoxical joy of being more alive when near risk. Clarity, the stripping away of illusions, leaving what matters most. Themes: mortality and transformation near-death encounters. Research into near-death experiences, Grayson, 2003, shows how brushes with death often leave people with lasting changes. Greater appreciation of life, less fear of mortality, and deeper compassion. The threshold with death transforms values. Extreme sports psychology. Studies of base jumpers, free solo climbers, and ultramarathon runners reveal that risk creates a unique psychological state, heightened focus, altered time perception, and profound awe. The brush with danger becomes a form of meditation, existential philosophy. Thinkers like Heidegger and Kierkegaard argued that awareness of death is the root of authentic living. When mortality is faced, trivial distractions lose power and life gains urgency and depth. Sacred traditions. Many spiritual practices incorporate reminders of death. The Buddhist meditation on corpses, the Stoic practice of memento mori, the Mexican Day of the Dead. To live fully, one must keep death close. Personal reflection. One of the times I felt this dance most vividly came not from a dramatic accident, but from a quieter, more ordinary brush with risk. I was hiking along a steep trail with a friend, high above a valley. The path narrowed until it was little more than a ledge, loose stones crumbling underfoot, the drop plunging sharply to the side. Every step was a negotiation, balance, focus, breath. The chatter of the group fell away. At that moment I was utterly present. There was no room for stray thoughts, no space for distraction. It was just me, the ground beneath my feet, and the awareness that one wrong step could end it. When we finally cleared the ledge and reached safer ground, I felt a rush of exhilaration, not only relief, but clarity. The colors of the landscape seemed sharper, the laughter of my friend more alive, my own heartbeat a rhythm I could suddenly hear with reverence. That encounter with risk stripped away the fog of ordinary thought. It reminded me that life is never guaranteed, and that presence is both fragile and precious. Psychological insight, mortality as teacher psychology, has long wrestled with how proximity to death alters consciousness. Terror management theory, Becker, 1973, Greenberg et al., 1986, proposes that much of human culture, achievements, religions, even status seeking are ways of managing death anxiety. Yet paradoxically, those who confront mortality directly often report less fear, not more. Post-traumatic growth, Tedeschi and Calhoun, 1996. Survivors of near-death experiences often describe increased appreciation for life, deeper connections, and reprioritized values. Risk doesn't just threaten identity, it can refine it. Flow and mortality awareness. Risk heightens attention by aligning with flow states. When danger is real, the brain narrows focus, strips away distraction, and anchors us fully in the present. This neurological response mirrors spiritual states of meditation or trance. Contemporary research on awe, Keltner and Haidt, 2003. Awe induced by risk, standing before vast mountains, storms, or the edge of mortality, reduces ego and increases feelings of connection to something larger. The encounter with death paradoxically enlarges life. In my own experience on that mountain trail, I felt many of these dynamics at once. Mortality was not abstract, it was at my side, whispering with every loose stone. But instead of paralyzing me, it clarified me. It burned away noise and sharpened awareness, teaching me that life is both fragile and fierce. Embodiment prompt or practice. This week, seek out a small dance with risk, not reckless, but intentional. Take a cold plunge into the water. Walk a trail that challenges your nerves. Share a truth you've been afraid to voice. Notice how your body reacts, the rush of adrenaline, the quickening of breath, the heightening of senses. Afterwards, reflect. How did that brush with fear sharpen your sense of being alive? Integration moment and seed to plant. The dance with death is not about recklessness. It is about remembering that mortality is a companion, not an enemy. Risk reveals what comfort conceals, that life is fleeting, precious, and worth inhabiting fully. Seed to plant. This week, carry death as a quiet teacher. Whisper to yourself, I could lose this. Then notice how that awareness deepens gratitude for what is here, right now. Not all sacred risks happen on cliff edges or ritual grounds. Some arrive quietly, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Personal encounters with sacred risk isn't only found in the great expeditions or ceremonial trials. Sometimes it arrives in the fabric of ordinary life, moments where the outcome is uncertain, the stakes are real, and fear whispers that stepping forward could cost you. These are the risks that test not only the body but the spirit. Speaking up, leaving a secure path, saying yes when everything in you trembles toward no. When risk is personal, it shapes us directly. It breaks the neat division between ordinary life and threshold moments. We realize that sacred risk is not rare, it's woven into our choices, and each brush with it leaves a mark. Attributes of sacred risk adrenaline, the body's surge of energy when uncertainty peaks. Fragility, the awareness that safety is never guaranteed. Learning, the lessons risk carries, often clearer than any comfort. Humility, the recognition of limits in the face of uncertainty. Resilience, the strength forged through brushes with danger. Themes, everyday threshold, small dangers, lasting lessons. Not every sacred risk is a cliff face or a battlefield. It might be a conversation that risks rejection or a leap into an uncertain future. Calculated versus reckless. Sacred risk doesn't mean abandoning care. It means stepping into uncertainty consciously, aware of both the danger and the potential for transformation. The teacher within risk. What danger strips away is illusion. It teaches us that life is fragile, yet within that fragility lies vitality. Personal reflection. One of the clearest brushes I had with risk came when I first left home for university. It wasn't a physical danger like climbing cliffs or navigating storms, but it carried the same trembling sense of exposure. Everything familiar, family rhythms, childhood landscapes, even the friends I'd grown up with dissolved almost overnight. The real risk wasn't failure in exams. It was the possibility of isolation, of stepping into a new city and finding I didn't belong. I remember the first weeks vividly, walking through streets I didn't know, carrying books under my arm, but feeling like an imposter in the lecture halls. The adrenaline wasn't about survival in the physical sense. It was about the survival of self. That risk carved something deep into me. By leaning into the unfamiliar, I began to see resilience I didn't know I had. The fragility was real. There were nights I wondered if I'd made a mistake, but each time I persisted, it built a quiet confidence. In hindsight, those early weeks were a sacred threshold. They taught me that risk doesn't always wear the face of danger. Sometimes it wears the face from the beginning. Psychological insight, the inner edge of risk contemporary psychology, has begun to map how even everyday risks change the psyche. Sensation seeking, Zuckerman, 1994. While some people are drawn to extreme risks, most humans still engage in everyday risks, moving to new places, starting relationships, changing careers. These smaller risks still activate the same neural circuits of adrenaline and reward, risk and identity formation. Research on young adults shows that risk-taking often plays a role in identity development. Cote 2000. By stepping into unknowns, we test our edges, discover resilience, and learn who we are beyond comfort zones. Psychological safety nets. Studies also show that people who frame risk as growth rather than threat are more likely to experience resilience afterwards. Carver, 1998. The difference isn't the danger itself, but the meaning we assign to it. Existential risk-taking. Philosophers like Tillich and May argued that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. To take a personal risk, whether moving cities, confessing truth, or embracing change, is to affirm life in the face of uncertainty. My own leap into university life echoed this. It wasn't dramatic or headline-worthy, but it was still sacred. The fragility of those first steps, the humility of not knowing where I fit, and the resilience that emerged on the other side all carried the same shape as a ritual ordeal. Risk became a teacher, not in breaking my body, but in reshaping my identity. Embodiment prompt or practice. Think of one personal risk you've taken in your own life, not reckless, but meaningful. What was the danger you felt? What was at stake? What did you learn by stepping forward? Write down those three pieces and notice how even ordinary risks carry sacred lessons. Integration moment and seed to plant sacred risk does not always roar with danger. Sometimes it whispers with change, moving away, beginning again, speaking truth. The fear is real, but so is the transformation. Seed to plant. This week, notice one decision that feels risky, a conversation, a step, a choice. Ask, what might this risk be teaching me? Step forward with awareness and see if the fear isn't a doorway into becoming. Beneath every risk is a psychological fire, the trembling of the mind and the chance for transformation. Psychological insights, risk and the psyche. When we talk about risk, we often imagine cliffs, firewalks, or high-speed races. But psychology reminds us that the truest risks live inside us. Risk is not just about external danger. It is about the internal process of stepping beyond safety, breaking through defense, and surrendering certainty. The inner fire of risk. The psyche is wired for survival, which means it craves stability and predictability. But growth requires destabilization. To risk is to invite rupture, to allow the familiar scaffolding of the self to tremble so something new can be born. Attributes of risk in the psyche. Anxiety, the body's alarm when stepping into uncertainty. Courage, not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. Transcendence, moments where fear dissolves into flow or awe. Growth, new capacities forged under pressure. Surrender, the willingness to let go of control and meet what comes. Themes, psychological lenses on risk sensation seeking. Marvin Zuckerman. Zuckerman's research showed that some people are wired to seek intense experiences through speed, novelty, or danger. But he also noted that sensation seeking isn't just thrill chasing. It is often linked to creativity, openness, and adaptability. For some, risk is not escape but exploration. Flow states. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Risk pushes us into the edge between ability and challenge, the precise zone where flow emerges. Extreme athletes describe how danger heightens presence, fear narrows attention, and suddenly they are utterly immersed, alive in a way ordinary life rarely permits. Mortality awareness, Ernest Becker. In The Denial of Death, Becker argued that humans build entire worldviews to defend against the terror of mortality. Risk breaks these defenses. Standing close to danger exposes the fragility of life, but it also intensifies meaning, forcing us to choose what matters most. Contemporary research, studies in positive psychology, Sweeney, 2019, Kashtan and Sylvia, 2009, show that tolerating uncertainty and embracing risk correlates strongly with resilience and creativity. Risk, when navigated consciously, activates psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt and thrive under change. Personal reflection. For me, some of the deepest risks haven't been about cliffs or contests, but thresholds of choice. I think back to times when I stood at crossroads, moving into new work, speaking truths that could cost belonging, or walking away from structures that no longer fit. Each one carried its own form of fire. The anxiety was real, the heart racing, the mind looping through worst-case scenarios. But on the other side of those risks, I always found something unexpected, a sharper sense of who I was, a freedom from what I had feared would break me. Looking back, I see that risk was never just about the external outcome. It was about what shifted in me. The fire of risk burned away illusions, leaving a steadier kind of strength behind. Psychological insight. Deep expansion risk is transformative because it shakes the architecture of the psyche. Defense mechanisms are designed to keep us safe: avoidance, denial, control. But risk destabilizes these defenses, forcing us into direct contact with fear, mortality, and possibility. Existential psychology. Irvin Yalom described anxiety as the ripple of freedom. The very fear that risk provokes is also the sign that life is awake in us. To risk is to stand at the edge of mortality and still choose to move forward. Contemporary neuroscience. Studies on risk-taking, Knudsen and Greer, 2008, show that anticipation of risk activates both the brain's fear circuits, amygdala, and reward centers, nucleus accumbens. This dual activation explains why risk feels both terrifying and exhilarating. The psyche is simultaneously bracing for loss and reaching for transcendence. Meaning-making. Post-traumatic growth research, Tedeschi and Calhoun, 2004, reveals that those who encounter risk and survive often reconstruct meaning at a deeper level, reprioritizing relationships, values, and life purpose. In other words, risk doesn't just test us, it can rewrite us. Personally, I've come to see risk less as an external enemy and more as an internal ally. Each time I've stepped into the unknown, whether through truth-telling, moving into new work, or leaving behind the familiar, it has stripped me of certainty, but given me authenticity. Psychology frames it as growth under pressure. For me, it has felt like fire, dangerous, consuming, but necessary for renewal. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. This week, notice a small risk you've been avoiding. Is it a conversation, a decision, a step towards something you fear? Instead of shrinking, approach it as an experiment. Ask, what is the worst that could burn away if I do this? And what new strength might rise if I survive it? Integration moment psychology confirms what initiation rituals and personal experience already know. Risk is not just danger, it is doorway. The psyche trembles, the body alarms, the ego resists. But through the fire of risk, defenses soften, identities dissolve, and deeper truths emerge. Sacred risk is not recklessness. It is the conscious choice to meet the edges of uncertainty with courage, surrender, and presence. And in that meeting, the psyche itself is transformed. Seed to plant. Next time you feel fear pulling you back, ask, is this fear protecting me, or is it keeping me asleep? If it is the latter, take one step into the unknown. Risk is not only about survival, it is the practice of becoming fully alive. Which brings us here. How do we live with sacred risk, not as an exception, but as a daily practice? Living with sacred risk is not confined to marathons, mountains, or rituals. It is something we carry into the ordinary fabric of our lives. Living with risk doesn't mean reckless leaps at every turn, but cultivating a posture of courage, the willingness to step toward growth rather than retreat into safety. Carrying risk as a practice, not just an event to live with sacred risk, is to embrace the truth that life itself is uncertain. Every choice is a threshold, every yes carries danger, but when approached with awareness, risk becomes less about danger and more about aliveness. It is a spiritual practice, one that insists on presence, sharpens awareness, and calls us into deeper authenticity. Attributes of living with sacred risk: courage, the willingness to step forward even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Surrender, letting go of control, allowing life to unfold beyond certainty. Awareness, seeing risk not only in extremes but also in daily choices. Adventure, cultivating curiosity toward the unknown rather than fear. Vitality, risk as a spark that animates the spirit and keeps us awake to life. Themes, choosing growth over safety risk in daily life. Sacred risk doesn't only appear in high-stakes situations. It shows up in the small choices. Speaking truth, admitting vulnerability, starting something new. Beyond recklessness. Living with risk is not about recklessness, but about choosing meaningful edges that expand our lives. Risk without awareness can destroy. Risk with presence can transform. Spiritual discipline of risk. Many contemplative traditions speak of surrender as a core practice. Sacred risk is surrender in motion, an embodied willingness to walk into uncertainty with trust. Life as threshold. The ordinary is threaded with thresholds. Saying yes to a relationship, moving city, changing work, or revealing a hidden truth, each is its own fire of initiation. Personal reflection. One of the risks that shaped me wasn't on a marathon route or inside a ritual, it was in speaking up when silence would have been safer. There have been times in my life where I've carried truths that didn't sit easily with others, moments when my perspective or refusal to conform made me the odd one out. Choosing to say what I really thought, even when it cost me friendships or approval, felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of landing. The risk wasn't physical, but it burned just as fiercely. The possibility of rejection, of being misunderstood, of being cut off from belonging, all of it pressed hard. But each time I took that risk, I discovered something. That truth has its own fire, and walking through it leaves you lighter than the weight of silence ever did. For me, this is what sacred risk looks like in daily life. Not just cliffs and ordeals, but the ordinary courage of honesty. Each risk in speaking truth became a threshold, one that stripped away fear little by little and forged a more authentic self. Psychological insight psychologists studying courage note that risk is not the absence of fear, but movement in its presence. Brené Brown describes vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, suggesting that the most transformative risks are often relational, not physical. Speaking truth, expressing need, or admitting fear can be as daunting as standing on a cliff edge. Contemporary studies on authenticity, Kernis and Goldman, 2006, show that living congruently with one's values, even when risky, is linked to higher well-being and resilience. Suppressing truth for safety may feel protective in the short term, but it corrodes the self over time. Existential psychology reinforces this. Irvin Yalom argued that risk is inherent to living authentically. To choose freedom, meaning, and love requires risking rejection, failure, and mortality. To avoid risk is to avoid life. Looking back at the moments when I risked honesty over silence, I can see this principle in action. The fear of rejection was real, but the deeper cost would have been self-betrayal. Psychology gives words to what I learned through experience. That sacred risk isn't about adrenaline highs, but about aligning our actions with the truth we carry, even when it burns. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Take one small risk of honesty. Say something you've been holding back. Share a truth that matters to you, even if it feels vulnerable. Step into the edge of discomfort, not to provoke, but to live more congruently. Notice how your body responds, the racing heart, the dry throat, the sudden alertness. That is a sacred risk alive in you. Integration moment. Living with sacred risk is not about courting danger for its own sake. It is about choosing edges that matter, edges that test and reveal us. Whether it's climbing a mountain or speaking the truth, the essence is the same. Stepping into the unknown with courage and awareness. Sacred risk strips us of illusions of control, but in return it gives us presence, vitality, and authenticity. To live without risk is to live half asleep. To live with sacred risk is to walk daily into the fires that refine us, not recklessly, but awake. Seed to plant. The next time you feel fear rising around a choice, pause and ask, is this a risk that could awaken me? If the answer is yes, take one step closer to it. Let sacred risk become less an exception and more a rhythm, a way of walking through life awake. Sacred risk is never comfortable. It unsettles, exposes, and asks us to stand where safety falls away. But it is also where life sharpens. Every ordeal, every leap, every trembling choice carries the seed of transformation. Risk is not just danger, it is a teacher. It strips us bare, but in its fire we discover resilience, awe, and the deeper pulse of being alive. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, sacred risk is not the enemy of life. It is the fire that keeps us truly alive. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse: a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark trad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of posthuman consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.